Do not be afraid. Almost every time an angel appears in the Hebrew Bible, that is the first thing it has to say, not because these beings are gentle and reassuring, because the people who encounter them are terrified. The Roman soldiers guarding the tomb in Matthew 28 do not merely feel startled. The Greek text uses a word for being shaken to the foundations. Seismos is the same root as seismic, and they became as dead men. They collapse before a single word is spoken. The angel you picture, the calm humanoid with white feathered wings and a soft halo, appears nowhere in the Hebrew Bible. Not once, not in that form. That image has a history, but its history is not biblical. What the original texts actually describe is stranger, more specific, and considerably more difficult to look at. And the reason nearly every angelic encounter begins with a command not to be afraid has everything to do with what these beings actually were, and nothing to do with horror. This is what the Hebrew Bible says, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Start with a word. The English word angel does not come from Hebrew. It comes from the Greek angelos, which means, simply, messenger, a courier, a go-between. And the Greek word is itself a translation of the Hebrew malach. The Hebrew word malach appears approximately 213 times in the Hebrew Bible. It is used for human diplomatic envoys, for military scouts, for prophetic figures, for a messenger of death in poetic passages, and yes, for heavenly beings sent from the divine presence. What the word does not tell you is what these beings look like, what they are made of, or whether they have wings. Malach is a word of function, not of nature. It means one sent on a mission. That is the entirety of what the Hebrew Bible's primary word for angels actually communicates. What it does not tell you is why, when one of these messengers appears, the reaction is rarely calm. Most people who grew up in a church or with any exposure to Western religious imagery have a clear mental picture of an angel. Wings, a halo, a face of serene beauty. You have seen it on greeting cards, in Renaissance paintings, over nativity scenes for as long as you can remember. What almost no one has been told is that every single element of that image, the wings, the halo, the idealized human face, the calm, has a documented non-biblical source. Every element, the image that dominates Western imagination for over 1,000 years, was assembled from pieces that the biblical authors never put together. The scholars who have studied this most carefully, art historians, biblical linguists, archaeologists, find the weight of evidence pointing to a straightforward conclusion. The popular angel is a composite, built over centuries from materials drawn largely from pagan Greco-Roman culture, not from the text. So what does the text actually describe? That is where this gets genuinely interesting. Because the Hebrew Bible does not describe one kind of heavenly being, it describes at least three, and they look almost nothing like each other. The first category is the one that owns the word malach. These are the messenger beings, the ones who appear to Abraham, to Hagar, to Gideon in the Hebrew Bible, and continuing into the New Testament, to Mary and to the shepherds outside Bethlehem. They are overwhelmingly described as men, ordinary men. When three figures arrive at Abraham's tent in Genesis 18, Abraham sees three men and offers them hospitality. He washes their feet. He serves them a meal of curds and bread and a calf, freshly prepared. They eat. Nothing in the text marks them as visually extraordinary. Two of them are later called malach. One is identified directly with YHWH. When the malach YHWH appears to Gideon in Judges 6, Gideon does not realize what he is talking to. He calls the figure "my Lord," the Hebrew Adon, a polite term of address, and offers food. It is only after fire leaps from the rock and the figure vanishes that Gideon understands who he encountered. When the angel appears inside the temple in Luke 1, beside the altar of incense, Zechariah's reaction is described with two Greek words. The first is the word for a deep inner convulsion. Tarasso at its root means to agitate as water is agitated. The second is phobos, fear, and this being standing beside an altar looks like a man. The fear is not a response to visible monstrousness, it is a response to something else entirely. The something else is presence. These beings carry the weight and authority of whoever sent them. In a world where a king's ambassador speaks with the full authority of the crown, a messenger from the divine presence arrives bearing something the human nervous system is not equipped to receive calmly. That is why Altira, do not be afraid, is the formula. It is a formal reassurance, not a casual relax. The Hebrew grammatical construction uses the jussive negative. It literally means, let there not be fear. It is a command to stop a physiological process that has already begun. The pattern holds across both testaments. Gabriel speaks it to Zechariah. Gabriel speaks it again to Mary, 17 verses later. The angel at the tomb speaks it to the women while the soldiers are still lying motionless on the ground. The risen Christ speaks it to John in the book of Revelation, after John falls down as if dead. And the reason it keeps being necessary is that the beings the text describes, particularly outside the Malach category, are nothing like what anyone expected to see. The messenger who looks like a man is only the first layer. What comes next is something the Hebrew Bible barely has words for. The second category is the cherubim. The Hebrew word is cherubim, and its likely origin is in the Akkadian karabu, the great composite guardian figures that stood at the gates of Babylonian temples and palaces. You would know them as the lamassu, massive creatures with human heads, lion or bull bodies, and eagle wings. But the cherubim of the Hebrew Bible are not statues at a gate. They are living, and what Ezekiel sees of them in 593 BCE by the river Shebar in Babylon is the most elaborate description of any heavenly being in the entire Old Testament. Ezekiel 1 describes a windstorm from the north, a great cloud with fire and brilliant light. Out of the fire emerge 4 living creatures. The Hebrew text calls them chariot, not cherubim, not angels, but simply living things. Each has 4 faces, a human face, a lion's face, an ox's face, and an eagle's face. Each has 4 wings, straight legs with hooves like burnished bronze, and human hands beneath the wings. Beside each creature is a wheel, not a simple wheel, a wheel intersecting a wheel, set in the ground, glowing like topaz. The rims of the wheels are full of eyes, all the way around. When the living creatures move, the wheels move with them. When they lift off the ground, the wheels lift with them. Above the living creatures is a crystalline expanse that catches the light. Above the expanse is a sapphire throne. And on the throne, here Ezekiel does something remarkable. He does not say he sees God. He says he sees the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. 5 layers of hedging, stacked on top of each other, before he will describe even the outline of what he encountered. Ezekiel 1 does not call these beings cherubim. That identification comes only in chapter 10, when Ezekiel sees the same vision again and finally names what he saw, as if even the prophet needed time and a second encounter before he was ready to apply a category to what he had witnessed. The scholarly reading of this vision anchored in Walter Zimmerle's multi-volume commentary on Ezekiel, still considered the definitive academic reference nearly 50 years after it was written, points to something often overlooked about its context. Ezekiel is in Babylon. He is in exile. The temple in Jerusalem is still standing barely, and the theological crisis his community faces is whether YHWH can still be present with a people far from the land and the sanctuary. The chariot-throne vision is the answer. The throne of YHWH is mobile. It came to Babylon. It can go anywhere. The chariot are not decorative beings. They are the living vehicle of the divine presence, throne-bearers who carry the heaviest weight in the cosmos and move, Ezekiel says, like lightning. But here is what tends to get lost in the popular imagination. These are never called malach in this passage. They are not angels in the usual English language sense. They are a separate category entirely. And the word your tradition handed you collapsed the distinction before you ever had a chance to notice it. So the messenger beings look like men. The cherubim throne-bearers look like something Ezekiel spent 2 chapters finding words for. And now we need to ask a different question, one that turns the whole story around. If the Hebrew Bible never describes a winged, haloed, beautiful humanoid angel, if the ordinary messenger is a man and the cherubim are nothing like a man, then where did the angel you grew up with actually come from? Because someone built that image. Someone assembled the white wings, the halo, the serene expression, the gentle hovering presence, and placed it in every church, in every painting, in every Christmas card so thoroughly that most people have never once questioned whether it had any biblical basis at all. The answer is not that the church lied. The answer is more interesting than that, and more specific. The image was assembled from pieces, over centuries, from sources that had nothing to do with the Hebrew text, and the moment when it locked into place can be dated with surprising precision. But before we can answer the art history question fully, we need one more piece of biblical evidence. Because the third category of heavenly being in the Hebrew Bible is the one that makes the cherubim look almost conventional, and it connects to something unexpected in the wilderness tradition. The Hebrew word is seraph, plural, seraphim. You know the word, but what you may not know is what it means, and what else in the Hebrew Bible the same word is used for. The root seraph means to burn. The seraphim are the burning ones. They appear in exactly one passage in the entire Hebrew Bible. Isaiah chapter 6, the prophet's call vision, probably composed in the 8th century BCE. And the same root that names these burning throne beings in Isaiah 6, this precise Hebrew word seraph, is used in Numbers 21 for the venomous desert serpents that attack the Israelites in the wilderness. Fiery serpents, burning ones. The boundary between the throne beings of Isaiah's vision and the serpent imagery of the wilderness tradition is, in the Hebrew text, genuinely porous. That is where we are going next. Isaiah 6 is the only place in the entire Hebrew Bible where the seraphim appear as heavenly beings. One passage, composed during a specific crisis, the year King Uzziah died, around 740 BCE. This is Isaiah's account of being called to his prophetic mission. He sees the Lord seated on a throne, and the hem of the divine robe fills the temple. Above the throne stand the seraphim. Each has 6 wings, 2 cover the face, 2 cover what the text calls the feet, a Hebrew euphemism, widely recognized by scholars of biblical Hebrew, for the lower body. 2 are used for flight. They call to each other across the divine presence. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. The doorposts shake from the sound of their voices. The temple fills with smoke. Isaiah says, "I am undone." He is not describing wonder from a safe distance. He believes he is about to die. These beings are not messengers. They are not sent anywhere in this passage. They are throne attendants engaged in continuous liturgical worship. One of them takes a live coal from the altar with tongs and presses it to Isaiah's mouth to purify him. This is their function. They serve at the altar of a throne so saturated with holiness that proximity to it requires purification. The seraph as serpent connection is not speculation. Isaiah himself uses the word in chapter 30 for a flying fiery serpent in the wilderness regions. Numbers 21 uses nehasim seraphim, burning serpents, for the creatures whose venom kills Israelites in the desert. And Moses is commanded to make a bronze serpent on a pole to heal those bitten. Some scholars have proposed the seraphim of Isaiah 6 may originally have been conceived as serpentine beings, a minority scholarly view, but one grounded in the text's own language. What we can say with confidence is this: the six-winged burning throne beings of Isaiah 6 are nowhere described as winged humanoids. They cover their own faces. They cover their lower bodies. What Isaiah sees in the presence, he does not fully describe, because the seraphim themselves are shielding their gaze from it. So the messenger looks like a man. The cherubim move like lightning with wheels of eyes. The seraphim cover their own faces. None of them have the wings and halo you grew up with, which means someone built that image from somewhere else entirely, and the trail leads to a very specific place and a very specific moment in history. In the first 2 centuries after the New Testament texts were composed, roughly 50 to 312 CE, Christian artists depicted angels as bearded men in Roman tunics. The earliest known image of an angel in Christian art, in the Catacomb of Priscilla in Rome from the mid-3rd century, shows the Annunciation. Gabriel has no wings. The Sarcophagus of Junius Bassus, from around 359 CE, depicts an angel in the binding of Isaac scene, still no wings. For approximately 300 years after the New Testament was written, the visual tradition of the Church depicted angels as men, ordinary men, which is, as it happens, exactly what the messenger being passages in the Hebrew Bible describe. The wings enter Christian art in a single datable moment. Scholars of early Christian art document the earliest confirmed example of a winged angel in Christian iconography as the prince's sarcophagus found near Istanbul, attributed to the reign of Emperor Theodosius I, between 379 and 395 CE. The source of the wings is not the Bible. The source is Nike. The Greek goddess of victory, regularly depicted with large white wings, was the template the Christian artists borrowed. And the borrowing was, in historical terms, almost certainly not calculated. It happened in the cultural environment of a Roman Empire that had just officially adopted Christianity as its state religion, a world saturated with Greco-Roman visual language. The scholar's observation here is precise. The ordinary malach, the messenger being who appears 213 times in the Hebrew Bible, is nowhere in those texts described as having wings. The cherubim and seraphim have wings, but they are never called malach in the passages where their wings appear. The winged humanoid angel is the product of a fusion. The human form of the malach merged with the wings of the cherubim and seraphim, filtered through a pagan victory goddess, and locked into visual form by Christian artists working 3 centuries after the texts were written. 40 years after the prince's sarcophagus, the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome was completed, between 432 and 440 CE, commissioned by Pope Sixtus III. Scholars of early Christian art describe its mosaics as the crystallizing moment, the image of the winged angel that would serve as the template for every subsequent generation of Western Christian art. From that basilica forward, the winged angel was the standard. The wingless messenger man of the first 3 Christian centuries was gradually forgotten. The halo has an even stranger origin. Its first appearance in religious art has nothing to do with Christianity at all. The halo's origins are in Hellenistic depictions of the sun god Helios, a radiate crown of rays around the head. The disc halo type appears in Iranian religious art associated with the deity Mithra around 300 BCE and spreads westward through the Roman world. Roman emperors adopted it for imperial portraits as a symbol of divine favor or solar kingship. Early Christian artists were, according to the historical record, initially reluctant to use the halo precisely because they knew it was a pagan symbol, but as Christianity became the religion of the empire, the visual grammar of imperial art merged with the visual grammar of Christian devotion. The halo moved from emperor to Christ, and from Christ to the angels who surround him in Christian iconography. Not a single element of the popular angel image, then, has a direct biblical origin. The wings, Nike; the halo, Helios and Roman imperial art; the idealized human face of serene beauty; the Renaissance consolidation of Byzantine stylistic conventions; the plump-winged infant, the cherub of greeting cards, is perhaps the most confusing case of all. The chubby baby angel is not a biblical cherub, it is a putto, a Greco-Roman decorative motif borrowed from depictions of Eros and Cupid. Italian Renaissance painters incorporated these figures into religious scenes because they were a standard vocabulary of classical decoration. The confusion between the putto and the biblical cherub, the 4-faced, hooved, lightning-fast throne-bearer of Ezekiel, is one of the more dramatic iconographic accidents in Western art history. There is one more category of heavenly being the Hebrew Bible describes, and it complicates the picture further. In Job 1 and 2, a group of beings called Bnei Ha-Elohim, the sons of God, present themselves before YHWH in a heavenly assembly. Among them is Ha-Satan, the adversary, a prosecutorial figure, a function, not yet the proper name and cosmic villain of later tradition. In Genesis 6:1-4, the Bnei Ha-Elohim take human wives, and the text records that their offspring were the Nephilim, figures of extraordinary stature. No wings are described in either passage. These beings look like men, enough to take human women as wives. Biblical scholar Michael Heiser, in his widely read work, The Unseen Realm, argues that this Bnei Ha-Elohim tradition represents what he calls a divine council, YHWH presiding over a court of supernatural beings of a lower order. This is one influential scholarly reading of these texts, and it draws on earlier academic work documenting the divine council tradition in ancient Near Eastern literature, including Canaanite texts from Ugarit. Whether his specific cosmological claims represent scholarly consensus is contested, but the basic observation that the Hebrew Bible describes a heavenly court, populated by beings distinct from YHWH, is grounded in the texts. And none of these beings, the messenger man, the 4-faced chariot throne bearer, the 6-winged burning throne attendant, the Son of God in the divine assembly, have been described wearing white wings and a halo. Not one of them. Later texts, including the Dead Sea Scrolls, particularly the songs of the Sabbath sacrifice from Qumran, expanded the hierarchy further, describing cherubim, seraphim, and the wheels of the chariot as 3 distinct orders of heavenly beings in the divine throne room. But that classification system belongs to Second Temple Judaism, not to the Hebrew Bible itself. And the far more elaborate nine-choir hierarchy that most people know, the one with archangels, dominions, thrones, and powers, that comes from a writer working around 500 CE called Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, drawing more from Neoplatonist philosophy than from the Hebrew text. Here is what the full picture looks like. The Hebrew Bible describes a heavenly reality populated by at least 3 distinct categories of beings, with radically different descriptions, radically different functions, and almost nothing in common with the popular icon. The messenger being looks like a man. The cherubim throne-bearers are multi-faced, multi-winged, wheel-accompanied presences whose movement sounds like a roar, and whose appearance was described by a prophet using 5 layers of hedging language. The seraphim are burning throne attendants who cover their own faces in the divine presence. And the titles claim that every angel says, "Do not be afraid," is, to be precise, a dominant pattern rather than an absolute rule. Genesis 18 is the clearest counterexample. Abraham shows no described fear when those 3 figures arrive, but across the broader sweep of the text, the pattern is unmistakable. It is, statistically, the most consistent opening line in any angelic encounter the Bible records. None of these descriptions are frightening in a cheap sense. They are overwhelming in a specific sense. They carry, in the logic of the text, the weight of the presence they serve, and that is exactly why almost every person who encounters one needs to be told, immediately, "Do not be afraid." The reassurance is not saying "I am harmless." It is saying you can survive this encounter. That is a different kind of reassurance entirely. The gap between the biblical text and the popular image is not small. 300 years of wingless Christian angels were replaced, beginning in the late 4th century, by a winged figure borrowed from a pagan goddess of victory. The halo came from Imperial Roman and Hellenistic solar iconography. The beautiful, serene human face was assembled through centuries of Byzantine and Renaissance artistic convention. The plump baby cherub arrived from Greco-Roman Cupid imagery. This is not a story about concealment. No council decided to replace the biblical description with a pagan one. The process was gradual, largely unconscious, and deeply human. Artists working in the visual language of their culture translated a faith they held into images that spoke to their contemporaries. The results accumulated, and each generation received the accumulated image as tradition. But it is also true that the accumulated image is not what the text describes, and that gap matters, not because it destroys something, but because what the text actually describes is richer than what replaced it. Ezekiel, by a canal in Babylon, sees the chariot throne of YHWH moving through the sky of a foreign land. The theological point, that the divine presence is not confined to a temple, not anchored to a geography, not captive to any nation or institution, is made visible in those 4 living creatures and their lightning-fast movement. The chariot are not decorative. They are the text's answer to the exile community's deepest question: is God still here? Isaiah, standing in the temple in the year a king died, hears the seraphim declaring, "The whole earth is full of his glory," while he himself is convinced he is dying from the proximity. The point is not that the seraphim are visually interesting. The point is that the holiness they serve is so total, so complete, that even these beings, the burning ones, the throne attendants, cover their faces before it. If they cover their faces, what is Isaiah seeing? What was Isaiah even able to see? And the messenger being, standing beside an altar, or appearing in a desert, or arriving at a tomb at dawn, carries something that makes trained soldiers collapse and experienced religious leaders convulse with fear, not because it looks monstrous, because it arrives as a representative of a weight the human frame was not designed to receive standing up. The "do not be afraid" is the text's testimony to what these beings were for. They were for the crossing of a boundary that ordinary life does not cross. They were for carrying a message between what is and what is more than what is. And the first task every time was to make the human being on the other side functional enough to receive it. What the Hebrew Bible actually describes when it uses the word malach, when it shows Ezekiel the four-faced throne bearers, when it places the burning ones above Isaiah's head, is not what stained glass and greeting cards have handed down. The texts are specific, grounded in ancient Near Eastern visual language, and considerably more theologically precise than any of their subsequent artistic interpretations. Understanding where the popular image came from, Nike, Helios, the prince's sarcophagus, the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore, does not diminish anything. It makes the history of how people have tried to imagine the unimaginable visible. It shows you the seam between the text and the tradition, which is where the most interesting questions in biblical study always live. And going back to what the text actually says, the man by the altar who makes a priest go pale, the four-faced being whose movement sounds like an army, the burning throne attendant who covers its own face, gives you something the icon never could, the original text's own testimony to what holiness, encountered directly, actually does to a human being. If the gap between what the text actually says and what the tradition handed down is the kind of thing you want to keep exploring, subscribe. Every video on this channel starts where the translation stopped.